Alright, today we're going to talk about reading and writing files using our Python programs. So the purpose for doing this is, number one, it lets us get information into our programs way faster than having to wait for the user to type them in every time. And for the writing files, we do that so that we can save the output from our programs and we can have that data be stored long term. We don't have to just look at the console. Let's say we're doing data analytics. We can read in all of the data we need to analyze. We can do some analysis, and then we can output a file storing the results of our analysis. And then we can look at that later, so we don't have to go back and forth and look at our console and have to wait for stuff. There are three primary steps to reading and writing a file. Number one, we have to open the file. Number two, we have to either grab data out of the file and then process it, or we need to process our data somehow and then output it into the file. So either read the data or write the data. And number three, we need to close the file. So let's look at each of those steps. So for the open function, there are lots of optional parameters in this function, but we're only going to deal with two of the parameters. Number one is the name of the file, which we're given, we need to store it as a string, and if the file and the Python file that we're running aren't in the same folder on our computer, we need to tell our Python program where on the computer it's located. This doesn't come into play very largely on VCHS, so we don't need to worry about it a whole lot. And secondly, we need to say what mode we want to open the file in, either read mode or in write mode. That's also going to be stored as a string, either the string R or W if we want to read or write respectively. So the open function is going to make a variable. It's going to return a variable of the file type, and it looks like this. So we have our in-file variable. I'm calling it that because I'm going to be reading in, and it's a file variable. So because I'm in a read mode, we're going to open a file. My file's name is going to be filename.txt. I'm opening a text file. I need to say what type of file I'm opening. And then again, I'm opening in read mode. And open is just a standalone function. I don't need to dot anything to get open. If I want to read a single line out of a file, I can use the readLine function, which is part of my file variable. So I can just say infile.readLine, and that will return a string. It'll give you the next available line in my file. And a line is determined when it finds a new line character. So it sees a /n, like we learned at the beginning. If it sees one of those new lines, it's going to say, oh, that's the end of this line, and return that line. And if I want to read a whole file line by line, instead of just calling readLine over and over again, I can just use a for loop. I can say for each line in that file I'm looking through, I can just print that individual line. And we're allowed to do multiple operations with the data that we read in from a file. Any kind of data we get, it's always going to come through as a string, but we can print it, we can typecast it, we can save it into a list. Any data, like we've been able to get data from the user for basically this whole class. And the data that comes from a file is functionally identical to the data that we get from the user typing it in. The biggest difference between data from a file and data from the user is that data from a file includes new line characters. So the string is going to have a /n built in at the end. So if we don't want to store that in our variable when we're actually using it, we can use a .strip on that line before we start using it. Jumping over to writing, I can write into a file using the .write function, also built into my file variable. And this function will append whatever string value you pass it, so it takes a string as a parameter, and it will append it to the file that you're accessing. If you try to write a value that's not a string, Python will complain. You can only pass strings to your write function, so you'll need to typecast them before you're allowed to do so. And if you want your output file to have multiple lines, you need to include line breaks. So you need to include that /n, you need to include that new line escape character in the string if you want it to be included in the output. So as an example, I've got my out file, because I'm going to be writing out of my program to this file. I'm going to open words.txt in write mode. I'm going to get some input from the user, save it into my variable words. While the user didn't enter the word stop, I'm going to write into my out file whatever they said plus a new line character, because my input isn't going to include a new line, so I want to make sure that I'm adding that new line when I'm writing. And then I'm going to get another input, so I'm going to loop until the user has said stop. Alright, so that's step 1 and 2, opening and then reading or writing. Step 3, our last step, is closing the file. And we do that with the file variable .close function. When we are reading, that's just going to free up some memory for the computer to do other tasks. When we close the file variable after writing to it, that will save the data that has been written. The data is not saved when we write it until we close the file. So if we don't close and the program ends, none of the data we've written will be saved. It'll just get lost. So it's very important that we close, especially when we're writing. So as a full example for reading, we have our in-file equals open. We're opening words.txt in read mode. For each line in that file, we're just going to print that line. And then we're going to just close our file. Reading is super simple. And then writing, it's the same example as before. We're opening our file, getting some input, looping until they say stop, and we're just adding whatever words they say to our file. And then at the end, very important, we need to make sure that we close our file. All right, as a brief example,